There is a moment, quiet, ordinary, when a husband stands in a crowded room and realizes his wife is looking through him, not at him. He smiled that night. He held his glass and nodded politely. And later, driving home alone, he understood something he had been refusing to understand for a very long time. This is the story of Daniel Hargrove and his wife Priya Hargrove. They had been married for 7 years, long enough for love to settle into something comfortable, and comfortable enough that neither of them noticed when it began to hollow out. Daniel was a quiet man, not cold, not distant, but the kind of man who expressed care through presence rather than performance. Priya was ambitious, electric in rooms full of people, someone who knew how to be remembered. For years, these differences had balanced them. But balance, left unexamined, can slowly tip, and by the time one person realizes the weight has shifted, the other has already adjusted to the new angle. The morning of the Alderton Capital Annual Gala, Priya was already dressed when Daniel came downstairs. She was standing at the kitchen counter with her phone in her hand, scrolling, still wearing her earring only on one side. "You look beautiful," he said. She glanced up, not at him exactly, past him, toward the clock on the microwave. "We need to leave by 7, she said. "Don't forget to wear the gray blazer." The navy one photographed Stark. He poured himself a coffee he wouldn't finish and nodded. They had attended events like this before, quarterly dinners, charity evenings, industry lunches. Daniel had always come as her husband, which was the entirety of the role expected of him. Stand nearby. Shake hands when introduced. Do not talk about work unless asked. Priya had never said these things directly, but over the years they had accumulated into an unspoken agreement. The car ride was quiet. Not uncomfortably so at first. Priya reviewed something on her phone. Daniel drove. The city slid past them in amber and gray. "Will Elliot be there?" he asked, somewhere on the highway. "Of course. He's the one hosting it." Elliot Voss, Priya's boss for the past 3 years. Daniel had met him twice. Both times, the man had been exactly the sort of person who made other people feel they should be grateful for his attention. "He's bringing his wife?" Priya made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite dismissal. "Elliot doesn't really bring his wife to these things." Daniel didn't ask the follow-up question. He should have. The event was held at the Marlowe Hotel, a building of tall windows and low lighting. The kind of venue designed to make everyone inside feel they had arrived somewhere that mattered. Priya moved through the lobby with the ease of someone returning home. She kissed cheeks, touched arms, laughed in the precise register that said she belonged. Daniel followed. He was introduced to 3 people in the first 20 minutes. Each introduction was the same. "And this is my husband, Daniel." A brief smile from the other person. A handshake if he was lucky. Then the conversation would pivot back to Priya, to a campaign result, a client acquisition, something Elliot had said in a meeting last Thursday. He didn't mind. That was the thing he kept telling himself, quietly and sincerely. He genuinely didn't mind. He found a spot near the edge of the room and watched. And that was when Elliot Voss appeared. He was the kind of tall that seemed deliberate. Or maybe that was just the way he moved, like space owed him something. He wore a navy suit and spoke before extending his hand. "You must be someone's +1, Elliot said, not unkindly. Almost casually, the way you might comment on the weather. Daniel looked at him. "Priya's husband," he said. Elliot smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the muscles responsible for warmth. Right, Daniel." He repeated the name as though he were trying to remember where he'd put it. "And what is it you do, Daniel?" "Private investment. Mostly mid-sized commercial portfolios." "Wonderful," Elliot said, already half turning. "Priya, there you are." And just like that, Daniel was gone from the conversation. Not rudely, not dramatically. He was simply no longer present in the room that Elliot Voss occupied. Across the hall, Priya laughed at something her boss said. Her hand touched his arm, briefly. A colleague nearby caught another colleague's eye. Daniel noticed all of it. He picked up a fresh glass from a passing tray. He stood in the warm light of the Marlowe Hotel. and something small and important shifted inside him. Not breaking, not even cracking, just settling. The way a house settles in winter. A sound so familiar you almost forget it means something is changing. He didn't bring up the evening when they got home. Priya was tired in the particular way she got after events. Not physically, but socially drained. As if she had spent all of herself and needed to recover in silence. They moved through the bedroom routine without conversation. She removed her earrings at the mirror. He hung up the gray blazer. She mentioned that Elliot had been pleased with the Castellan pitch. He said that was good. In bed, she fell asleep quickly. Daniel lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the way she had introduced him. The evenings when she spoke of Elliot, not with obvious affection, but with a frequency that had become its own kind of signal. Elliot thinks the market is shifting. Elliot doesn't believe in work-life balance, but somehow it works for him. Elliot said something today that I keep thinking about. Daniel was not by nature a jealous man. He had never confused attention with betrayal. But he was, above all things, an observant one. And what he had been observing, slowly and without urgency, was a marriage in which he had become peripheral. He had let it happen. That was the uncomfortable truth he turned over in the dark. He had been so careful not to crowd her, not to be the husband who demanded presence or performance, that he had receded so far he'd become invisible. She used to ask him about his work. In the early years, she had been genuinely curious about the way he read markets, the patience of watching something accumulate value quietly over years. She had called it his superpower once, without irony. That was a long time ago. Now she said things like, "Just tell me the version I can explain at dinner." And he would give her that version, and something would diminish a little. Each time, he thought about the Carlyle Group, about the fact that Alderton Capital, Elliot Voss's firm, was currently in the third month of a major refinancing proposal. A proposal that required, among other things, approval from a consortium of silent investors. Daniel's firm held a 14% stake in that consortium. It was not a secret. It was simply something Priya had never thought to ask about. He had never volunteered it, not out of strategy, not out of any plan. He was a private man. He had separated his professional life from their social life the way you separate certain things you value, because mixing them had always felt careless. He understood now that she didn't know, and he found himself wondering, in the dark, whether it would have changed anything if she had. A week passed, then 10 days. He watched Priya come home from late evenings with a brightness she didn't bring back to him, watched her compose texts with a slight smile, then set the phone down when he entered the room, not hiding, not exactly, more like remembering to be a wife when she had been something else all day. One evening over dinner, she said, "Elliot thinks I should take the lead on the Harwick account. It would mean more travel, but it's a real step up." "Do you want that?" Daniel asked. She looked at him as if the question were beside the point. "Of course I want it," she said. "It's a significant move." "I meant, do you want the travel? The hours?" She was quiet for a moment. "Daniel, I need you to support this." And he did. He said he did. He passed her the bread and asked about the timeline and was supportive in every way that was asked of him. Later, alone in his office, he opened his laptop and looked at the Alderton Capital refinancing file. He read through it carefully. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey. Then he made 2 calls, one to his legal contact and one to his silent business partner, a man named Robert Finch, who listened well and spoke rarely. Daniel didn't say much on either call. He asked a few questions. He received a few answers. Then he sat for a long time, not doing anything, just thinking. He wasn't planning anything. He was simply, finally, paying attention. The Harwick onboarding dinner was held on a Thursday evening at a private room in Castello's, the kind of restaurant where the menus have no prices and the lighting flatters everyone equally. Priya had mentioned it twice. Daniel had not been invited, which was normal. Client dinners were not +1 occasions. He went anyway. Not to confront anything. He had been invited, in fact, just not by Priya. Robert Finch had called that afternoon to mention that the Harwick principals would be present and that given Daniel's stake in the refinancing consortium, his quiet attendance had been requested by the Financial Advisory Board. He arrived after the first course. He came through a side entrance, seated at a table one removed from the main party, which was how these things were arranged when discretion mattered more than visibility. Priya didn't see him at first. He watched the table from a comfortable distance. Elliot Voss at the head, animated, performing, Priya to his right, not across the table, but beside him, laughing in that register he recognized. There was a closeness to the arrangement that wasn't inappropriate exactly, but it was the kind of closeness that assumes permission. He watched and he felt something old and quiet move through him. Not rage, not the spike of betrayal he had perhaps half expected, more like grief, a low, settled grief, the kind that arrives not when something breaks, but when you realize it was gone long before you looked. Partway through the main course, one of the Harwick principals, a man named Gerald Osey, leaned across toward Elliot and said something about the refinancing timeline. Elliot responded with confidence, the way he always responded, as if certainty were a posture one could simply decide to adopt. Then Gerald looked toward Daniel's table. He stood, crossed the room, and shook Daniel's hand warmly. The table went quiet. Elliot's expression shifted by 1 or 2 degrees, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Gerald said loud enough to carry, "Daniel, I didn't know you'd be here. Good to have the man who actually holds this thing together in the room." There was a pause. The particular kind of pause that happens when a room quietly recalibrates. Priya turned. She saw her husband. He was sitting with a glass of water in a room she hadn't known he would enter, and the expression on her face passed through several things very quickly. Surprise, confusion, something that looked almost like embarrassment, before settling into a stillness he didn't know how to read. He didn't smirk. He didn't perform. He nodded at her the way you nod at someone you know well, gently, without triumph. Elliot stood and crossed the room with his hand extended. His voice was easy, practiced. "Daniel, forgive me. I didn't realize you were connected to the Harwick side of this." "I'm not, directly," Daniel said. "I hold a position in the advisory consortium. It's fairly administrative." "Of course," Elliot said. His smile was the same as the one from the gala. Identical construction, but behind it something had rearranged. Later, when the dinner was concluding, Priya appeared beside him. The rest of the room gave them the unremarkable privacy of a couple having a quiet word. "You didn't tell me," she said. "No," he agreed. "Why?" He thought about this genuinely. "I don't think I knew what I was waiting for," he said. "Or maybe I was hoping I was wrong about a few things." She didn't ask what things. Perhaps she already knew. He drove home alone that night. She stayed to wrap up the evening. He sat in the car in their driveway for a few minutes before going inside, and the house was very dark and very quiet, and he let himself feel the full weight of it. Then he went to bed. He slept better than he had in months. 3 days later, he told her he was going to stay with his brother for a while. He said it plainly, without accusation, the way you state a fact that has simply become true. She didn't argue. That was perhaps the most honest thing that had passed between them in a year. 4 months later, Priya moved to her apartment, the one she had rented in October, with the efficiency of someone who had decided that forward motion was a form of healing. She had repainted the living room. She had started running again. She called her mother more often. She had not started divorce proceedings, and neither had Daniel. This ambiguity was something she told herself was practical, but in honest moments she recognized it for what it was. A door left slightly open by both of them, for reasons neither had examined aloud. The Harwick account had been reassigned. Elliot had done it graciously, in the way people do gracious things when the alternative has become too costly. He had told her it was structural, a project timeline issue. She had nodded and said she understood. She did understand. That was the particular loneliness of it. She had not been having an affair. She needed to say that to herself occasionally. plainly, because the truth of a thing could still be painful even when it absolved you. There had been something, a closeness, an energy, that she had allowed to exist and had not named, because naming it would have required a honesty she had not been prepared for. She had told herself it was professional. She had told herself Daniel wouldn't understand or wouldn't notice or wouldn't feel it the way she feared he might. None of those things had been true. She thought about the night of the Harwick dinner often, not the exposure of it, the strange stillness of his face, the way he had nodded at her, not with anger, with a kind of sorrowful recognition. It was the nod that stayed with her. She had spent a long time in the marriage, interpreting his quietness as withdrawal, as indifference. She had told herself in the small hours that he wasn't truly present, that he was there in the house but not really with her. This interpretation had allowed her to justify things she couldn't otherwise account for. But she was beginning to understand that his quietness had been a language she had never learned to read. He had been fully present. She had simply stopped looking. Daniel, for his part, was not doing what she had perhaps expected. He was not embittered. He had dinner with old friends. He worked. He spent a weekend with his brother and nephews. He read the books that had been stacked on his nightstand for 2 years. One evening he cooked a proper meal for one and sat at the kitchen table and listened to the radio and felt something he eventually identified as peace, unfamiliar, tentative, but real. He thought about Priya with the complexity she deserved, not as a villain, not as someone to be forgiven in a theatrical sense. As a person who had gotten lost in the middle of something, the way most people do, and had not found her way back before the distance became too significant. He missed her. That was also true. He missed the version of their life that had existed before he had understood how to properly see it. In November, she texted him. "Just, how are you?" he replied. "Honestly, okay. You." She took 20 minutes to respond. "Getting there," she wrote. He read it and set his phone down and went back to what he'd been doing. But he thought about those 2 words for the rest of the evening. Getting there. The honesty of them, the distance still embedded in them. Robert Finch called the following week with news about the consortium restructuring. Alderton Capital's refinancing proposal had been declined. Not dramatically, but decisively. Elliot Voss would rebuild. Men like Elliot Voss always did. But something had shifted in the landscape. Quietly, the way things that matter tend to shift. Daniel listened to Robert's summary, asked 2 questions, made a note, and thanked him. Then he sat in his office and thought about Priya. About how little any of it had ever been about Elliot Voss. About how the real story had always been smaller and more important than any boardroom or business deal. He thought about a Sunday morning from 3 years ago when she had fallen asleep on the couch with her head on his shoulder and a book open on her chest, and he had stayed very still for an hour so as not to wake her. He had read her book while she slept. He had thought that afternoon, this is enough. This is more than enough. He didn't know when he had stopped saying that to himself. He didn't know when she had stopped feeling it, but that was the question that mattered now, and it was the only one worth sitting with honestly. They met for coffee in January. Priya had suggested it. Neutral ground. A small place on Weston Street that neither of them had been to before. She arrived first. She was sitting with her hands around a cup when he walked in, and she looked up with the expression of someone who has rehearsed the moment enough that the rehearsal is visible. He sat down, ordered something simple. The waiter left. "You look well," she said. "So do you." A pause. Not uncomfortable exactly, but present. "I've been thinking about what I want to say," she began. "I have the whole thing organized in my head." She paused. "But now that you're here, it all seems beside the point." "It doesn't have to be," he said. "You can say it." She looked at her cup. "I think I spent a long time making you smaller than you were in my head, because it was easier. If you were someone I'd grown past, then I didn't have to examine why I was elsewhere." She stopped. "Then, that wasn't fair." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't easy to know," he said finally. I understand that. I kept a lot of myself contained. I thought I was protecting the space between us, but I think what I was actually doing was keeping you out. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not release, not quite, but a slight softening. The kind that arrives when you've been carrying a version of someone that was never fully real. Did you know, she asked, at the gala, did you already know about Alderton? Yes. And you didn't say anything? I didn't know how to say it in a way that wasn't an accusation. And I didn't want to accuse you. I wanted to see what was actually there. And what did you see? He thought about this carefully. Someone who had moved away from us, not toward someone else. Not the way I feared, but away from us. And I wasn't sure anymore if we still were an us worth moving back toward. He paused. That was the part I had to sit with. She didn't respond immediately. Outside, the street moved in its January grayness. A bus passed. The coffee cooled. Are we? She asked quietly. Worth it? It was the most honest question she had asked him in years. He recognized it. He honored it by not answering quickly. I don't know, he said. I think we were once. Genuinely. And I think we both let that become something we assumed rather than something we tended. He looked at her. But I'm not sure you can go back and tend what you let go of. Sometimes you can. I just don't know which kind of story this is yet. She nodded slowly. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't cry. She had, he suspected, already done her crying, privately, in the apartment she had made efficient with forward motion and fresh paint. I'm not asking to come back, she said. I just wanted you to know that I see it, what I did, what I didn't do. She paused. What I didn't see. I know, he said. Does it matter that I see it now? He considered her. This woman he had loved, genuinely and quietly for years, who had always been more electric than him, more visible, more comfortable with wanting to be seen. He had loved her exactly as she was, and somewhere in that love he had also disappeared. Yes, he said, it matters. Not as forgiveness, not as a door reopening, just as an acknowledgement that truth, spoken too late, is still truth, that seeing something clearly even after the damage is still worth something. They finished their coffee. They spoke a little longer. Nothing significant. The small practical details of two lives that had been shared and were now in the careful work of becoming separate. She asked about his brother. He asked about her running. When they stood to leave, she looked at him for a moment on the pavement. I hope it turns out to be enough, she said. Whatever you're building. You too, he said. And he meant it, fully and without remainder. He walked back to his car and sat inside for a moment before starting the engine. The street was gray and ordinary. A woman walked past with a dog. Someone was loading groceries from a car. The world continued at its usual indifferent pace. He thought about the Sunday morning with the book. He thought about the gala and the nod across a quiet room and the dinner in the dark after she had fallen asleep. He thought about all the small moments where love had been present and unannounced, and how easy it was to let the unannounced things go unnoticed until they were gone. He didn't know what came next for either of them. That uncertainty no longer felt like a wound. He started the engine. He drove, and somewhere behind him, the city continued its quiet work of holding all the lives inside it, each one carrying something it had lost, or was learning to carry differently, or had finally, painfully learned to set down. Some stories don't end with answers. They end with the weight lifted just enough to breathe again. That was enough. That was exactly enough.